more on this, I'm joined by Samir Puri in Singapore. He's the author of Russia's Road to War with Ukraine and the visiting lecturer at the Department of War Studies, King's College, London. Samir, good to have you on the program. So 2 years into this conflict, who has the upper hand, if anyone at all, especially given the latest Ukrainian retreat from Avdiivka?
Oh, thanks very much for having me. It's interesting that it's 2 years since the full-scale invasion, and Avdiivka has been a frontline town for a decade. So that was the fighting that began in 2014. So there's a lot of time that's elapsed. And in the last 2 years, you can really feel that the momentum has swung. Initially, of course, Russia surprised Ukraine with the extent of its invasion, but Ukraine very quickly recaptured the momentum in with its defensive efforts. And since then, there's been a real ebb and flow. And it's really right now, in the last few months, I think the last month and a half in particular, that the momentum feels like it's back with Russia. So there's nothing to preclude the fact that the momentum will swing again at some point in the future back towards Ukraine. But clearly, we're headed to a situation where neither side can win militarily in an absolute way. But that's certainly the mood at the moment. But it could, of course, change depending on, for example, if the Americans grant a big arms support package to Ukraine.
Yeah, how crucial is that support for Ukraine? Because since this war started, Ukraine has appealed to their Western allies for more military support, for more financial support. And of course, it's cost those allies billions of dollars. But if Ukraine does get this military support from the US, how much is it going to do for their cause against Russia?
I mean, it's as simple as being provided the artillery shells that are being used by the Ukrainians to, I think you could use the analogy of creating a sort of a wall of steel in the face of the Russian onslaught. So it's about who can fire the most artillery shells, and that is why the Russians have started to make the gains they have in the last few weeks, is the Ukrainians are having to ration how many shells they can fire. There's, of course, more to it than that. There are armored vehicles, there are air defenses, but the principle remains that mass, which is the amount of military material that either side can deploy, is one of the key factors in what has turned into a war of attrition. It's not a war of maneuver. When we see tanks moving through roads quite quickly, this idea that you can capture territory quite quickly, that you move quite grand sort of map moves of your military forces, that is not what Ukraine has experienced for, I think, more or less a year and a half of this 2-year full-scale invasion. It's a slow grind. And in amongst all of that, we have to remember that there is a huge human toll, hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides. And part of the attrition war that Ukraine is engaged in is that it's struggling to recoup its personnel losses in the way that the Russians have the advantage by being a much larger country.
Could it then be argued that more needs to be done to bring these two sides to the negotiating table, because this may not end on the battlefield, but rather with talks?
So what you've touched on is the crucial issue, and an unbelievably delicate issue. I can say from my own perspective, having worked in Ukraine a decade ago and what was a failing Minsk peace process, but nevertheless one that kept the conflict stabilized, I've always advocated for the exploration of negotiations, even if the Russians are understood to be deceitful negotiators, which is the argument that's used to avoid negotiations. The Russians will lie, they'll go back. Well, I think we should also remember that in the first month of this full-scale invasion, there were direct face-to-face talks between Russia and Ukraine. And very appropriate, actually, that you're hosting me to mention this point, that Turkey was a convener of talks in Antalya, I believe, in March 2022. Now, of course, those talks did not settle the conflict, but there were proposals that were moved between the two different sides. And if nothing else, these episodes do illustrate the possibility of bringing the two sides to the table. However, 2 years in, with all of the horrific human losses, Ukraine, of course, has suffered civilian and military losses, and also the rhetoric of fighting to resist and push back the Russians. I think there's now going to have to be off-ramps for all sides to be able to contemplate coming back to the negotiating table. And it's not really a foreseeable event. But if you ask me, based on my opinion, having worked on a peace process around Ukraine in the first invasion, and having, of course, followed the conflict very closely and having written a book about it, this war is going to end in a de facto partition of Ukraine, not a de jure one. And so we really are now counting down the number of months and years, probably years, it will take for us to get to that sort of situation.
Okay, Samir Puri, really appreciate your analysis. Thank you so much.